Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Jerri, we had a really good event that we ran on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we had a fantastic speaker who, I think everyone was floored by just some of the statistics and the data she was providing us. So we said, Ashanti, you have to come on our podcast.
Absolutely. So Ashanti Jones she just rocked my world at that January 6th event because she shared with us you talked about the information and the statistics, and it really just broadened my horizon and made me think differently. I love when people make me think differently and rock my world. I think that's great. Ashanti Jones is connected in New Jersey with criminal justice reform. And she also is connected with school districts and can give us some really good ideas about how to move forward. And she has paved a path into the future, I believe, on how people should be thinking about reform. And so, Ashanti, we want to welcome you to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. And it is great to see you today. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. It's so good to see you again, Jerri and Jamie. I absolutely loved, participating in the summit and hearing from the other speakers and just engaging with everyone who was there. It was a really enlightening experience for me, and I'm really happy to hear that you all enjoyed my presentation.
Well, so much so that we didn't want you just to be confined to this New Jersey and tri-state area. We really want you to be able to share all of the work that you've done and all of the advocacy that you've been working on. Your past role was called what, and what was the purpose of it? I think that's where a lot of this stems from, right?
Yes. So I'm currently a policy analyst at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. But prior to that, I was our 150 Years is Enough campaign manager.
I love that.
Yeah, so a lot of words, but it was basically our campaign to close New Jersey's prisons and to re-envision what youth justice looks like across the state. And part of that looks like, building a continuum of care that flows to and through communities and schools, just to provide additional pathways that aren't punitive, but rather rehabilitative, and actually lift young people, toward a future that's really bright.
Right. Jamie, right before the show, Ashanti and I were talking, and I was saying that her job must be so emotional, working on policies to help people. I worry about people like you in that job because I can imagine it just wears you out. So what is it you're losing sleep on right now? What are you thinking about right now that's just really causing you to think?
Yeah, right now it is really difficult because I am a social worker by trade and the only one in my organization. So, I'm working amongst lawyers who can really look at things cut and dry. And I applaud them on the way that they do that. But we're also talking about children here, right? We're talking about young people as young as 12 years old. And as a mom myself, it's really difficult to think about my son ending up in a penitentiary that the state itself has said was built to adult standards. I just couldn't imagine that. And so right now we're still working on, even though my role has changed, what I do has not, because we're still working on getting that closure announcement. And so right now that's the biggest thing that's making me lose sleep, trying to figure out this next wave of youth justice. The state has already agreed that the youth prisons that we have are not conducive to the young people that we actually, have there. But we don't know what comes next, right? We can't necessarily agree on what comes next. So for me, it's like, we build this robust continuum of care that provides, schools with additional opportunities to not push people out, right? We don't have to rely on suspensions and expulsions. And it looks like not necessarily having to have prisons, but we sometimes lean on Old Faithful, right? And it's difficult for state actors to envision a future without prisons, even if they are for kids.
Jerri, we had on our 100th episode a clip from Ken Shelton, who was talking about the percentage of preschoolers who were suspended in California. And that just broke my heart. It really broke my heart. So Ashanti, what are some of those suggestions? Because I think that's the starting point. When we look at root cause, right? You want to keep them in school and not suspend them. So, I mean, I'm sure there are infractions that, yes, obviously kids have to be suspended, but what are some cases that you're seeing where students are suspended? And then what are the recommendations that could be done instead of that?
Right. So really great question, Jamie. I would say that when you think about a school building, right, we really leave our kids there to learn, to become citizens, right, to chart their way forward. But unfortunately, we sometimes realize that even though we're looking at the young people that they will be, right, and the adults that they will be, that they're not yet there, right? And we expect, our expectations of our students are just too much, right? We can't expect 5 and 6 year olds to sit and look forward and just do, whatever the teacher says all day. Like, there will be some that deviate from that. And I think the biggest picture is looking at our children as children. When I've been talking recently to school administrators, those in charge of, school safety or school supports, and what I'm seeing is that a lot of people or young people are getting suspended for fighting, right? No two people are alike, right? There's bound to be disagreements, and young people don't even get their impulse control until they're between 5 and 7.
Yeah.
And even then, we're not necessarily making all the right decisions, right? And so suspending preschoolers and 4 and 5-year-olds for infractions like that, it just doesn't make sense. Like, the science isn't there to support that.
But even to your point, like 13 and 14-year-olds too, we have to think of another way. Maybe, obviously, there's a lack of communication skills. So maybe that's the root cause. Maybe we start there. I love you quote. I love your quote was, "I do not stand by one decision I made when I was 14 years old." And I thought, my gosh, because kids, their life trajectory can be totally off course because of one bad decision they made when they were 14.
Absolutely.
That's such a good point.
And that's what we're seeing, right? In New Jersey, we have 14-year-olds who are incarcerated right now. And as I said at the summit, I say this everywhere, I don't stand by a single decision I made at 14. I don't even stand by decisions I made at 21. So it's like, you have to recognize that even the brain science says that our executive functioning and be able to really understand and think through consequences doesn't kick in until we're 25, 26.
Oh, and really? 25, 26.
Yeah. And it's not, and that's not to say that, we can't be accountable for our actions, but we're still in a learning curve, right? And so necessarily being super punitive over really small infractions that are not necessarily causing bodily harm, injury, or death to someone is not really the way to go, especially when we're talking about education. And these are the most the primary years, the ones that we spend in education are the ones that really formulate how we respond to society once we are adults. If you get told and consistently told that everything that you do is being met with a punitive action, at one point you're going to go one or two ways. You're either going to be super scared to do anything, to take any kind of risk, right? Or you're going to completely disregard and say the system is just stacked against me and I'm just going to do what I want. And that's just how I'm going to live my life, right? And when you see young people coming into schools and they're consistently suspended for periods of 10 days or more, one school district that I'm talking about in New Jersey can suspend kids without having a hearing for up to 45 days. 45 days out of school. Like in most school districts, at 20 days of like absence on the parents' behalf, they get a referral to DCP&P. So how can the school, suspend young people? And so I think that alternatively, we can think about restorative and transformative justice, implementing those things in our school, and along with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. They can be buzzwords, right? They can be things that people like hear and think they understand, but don't really understand. At the end of the day, what we're trying to say is that the young people who show up in our classrooms are people with individualized identities, right? They have a whole set of issues that they're coming into your classroom with. And no one's saying the teacher or the administrators have to be the end all be all save all for every young person, but seeing young people as individuals and not just cattle, or sheep who they have to push through this system. and envisioning different ways to engage with those behaviors are ways that we can really stop that system.
Well, Ashanti, let me back up a second. What is restorative practices? Give us an example of what a restorative practice is for people that might not be familiar with this terminology.
Sure. So a restorative justice practice is basically an alternative way to address behavior. So the typical way, right, route one, the one that we default on is you do something wrong, you have to pay the consequences.
Right.
That's just it. And unfortunately for some young people, that means going to prison, right? Getting locked up, getting a record, getting suspended, getting expelled.
Does that style
Absolutely,
work?
it doesn't. It doesn't. In New Jersey, we see that 70% of young people who get incarcerated return in the next 3 years. So 70%, that's the magic number, 70% of those young people. And which is telling there's something in that system that's not necessarily working.
Right.
We spoke to some adults even who went through the juvenile justice system here in New Jersey, and they said they were made better criminals because of their time that they spent in juvenile justice, because you're pairing young people with other people who may not, who, you know, this young person who made a mistake with other people who may actually be intentionally doing things.
Good role models.
So restorative justice is an alternative pathway. It's recognizing that punitive measures don't work, right? Because most young people need to learn for themselves, right? And the best way to learn for yourself is to explore exactly the impact that my action had. The impact that my action had, and being able to understand how can I be held accountable for that action, right? And not being held accountable by paying with my time, but how can I be held accountable by righting that wrong, right? A punitive system doesn't right that wrong, and a restorative justice system does. And so one example that I like to use with folks talking about restorative justice and how it can be like seen in a community is, there's a shop owner, right? And he just a regular corner store, right, in the community. And a kid comes in and he's stealing bread or whatever, food all the time. That store owner has every right to call the police and say, I have a shoplifter, and detain that young person, right? And wait till the police get there and they can get booked and arrested. That's one option. Another option is for that, if we had restorative justice implemented in our communities, is for that shop owner to call that hub and say, listen, I have an issue with a kid who's consistently stealing from me, and I need to understand what's happening and how I can get it to stop. Right. And that hub would give them space to have a safe conversation. So the shop owner can let the kid know, like, listen, I'm not Walmart. We don't have like billions of dollars in loss retention. When you steal from me, you're actually taking money out of my pocket that I use to feed my family. And the kid may feel a little bad about that and say, well, it wasn't intentional. I wasn't stealing just because I'm a bad kid. Like, I'm hungry. I don't have money. I live in a poor community, and I'm stealing to eat. And the shop owner can then take that information and co-create a solution. Okay, I understand that this young person is hungry, and that's the reason why they're stealing from me. They're not just a bad kid. What is it that I can do to support this young person? And that may look like the young person coming, after school, taking out garbage, sweeping up, right? Helping unload boxes, different things, right? To pay back, right? Take accountability for the thing that they've done, but that also gives the shop owner an opportunity to understand their community a little bit better. Right. And they understand, like, listen, this is not the only kid who's been stealing from me. Right. I maybe have 10 offenders in a month. Right. Maybe there's a bigger issue going on here. How can I utilize my spot in this community to create change? Right. And that may look like saying, hey, listen, at the end of the month, I'll probably put a table out with stuff that I'm not going to be using anymore, but things that, and maybe creating partnerships with other local stores to do the same thing. Right. So people can come and get things for free. Right. And that's transformative justice, right? How we can leverage individual accountability and action into community action. Right. And what that does is gives us a deeper understanding and a feeling of connection to our community. Right. And relationships are at the basis of everything. Yes. When you restore those relationships between the young person who did something and the person who was offended, that's a win. That's another resource for that young person.
I love how you connect. You said first, the store owner needs to communicate, right, with this child who is stealing. So there's relationship building right there, and empathy. And then also having you talking to them on a level like, you're taking this out of my pocket. So now that child is also being able to build this relationship and build empathy and maybe a little bit of remorse, so that we're connecting on a human level. And then you have this whole community aspect with the transformative, where the community is involved. And so now again, that building of relationships, like you said, is absolutely key. We're humans, so connect on human level. And I think that's part of the root cause that we're addressing here.
Ashanti, what does this look like in a school?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I love talking about this part of it, because a lot of folks, we talk about the school to prison pipeline all the time,
Right.
but we don't really talk about the community to school pipeline. Right. And that, like, young people are coming from this community. If this community is affluent, right, and it has all the resources, all the extracurriculars, that young person is already coming with a whole set of protective factors in your classroom. They have resources. They're not necessarily hungry, right? They can probably excel with very little, integration or intervention, rather, in a school. But when that young person is coming from an impoverished community, right, where there's violence, there's crime, there's grief, right, there's residual trauma, they bring that into the classroom. It inhibits their ability to learn, right? And so as administrators, right, I don't even want to put the burden on the actual educators so much, because they have so many young people. But when you're talking about culture change, right, you can take a look at your school policies and look and see, okay, what kind of infractions are we penalizing, right? And let's look at the history, like what kind of infractions are we actually seeing, right? Are there other ways to address this behavior other than suspension and expulsion? It's the easy way to tell you, like, okay, listen, get out of the school for 10 days, come back with parent, out of sight, out of mind. You do absolutely nothing to create any solution for that behavior. So when you take restorative justice and you implant it into a school, if there's a young person who is, butting heads with an educator, they don't know why. It's just like, it's very easy to put that young person out of the classroom. They're just, they're insolent. We can't, I don't want to handle this young person. What can happen is a restorative justice conversation, right? And say, listen, for the past 3 months, you've been in my classroom. What's going on? What is it about my teaching style or anything that's not landing with you? And how can we fix this? A simple conversation can fit. And it may just be because, like, listen, I really can't really focus because, like, I have such and such going on. You're like, okay, now I know I don't have to suspend you for your behavior, but rather connect you to a school social worker who can, prepare some options for you. Even work student to student. If there's a fight or something that's happening, very easy to suspend and get them both out of the school. The issue is not resolved. Just because, like, they're still going to have the issue when they come back into school. So it's having a look and sitting them down and saying, it doesn't even have to be an administrator who's present, but just a trusted mediator. And, like, what started this fight? It could be as simple as a miscommunication, but understanding exactly from both sides what has happened and how would you feel that wrong was righted, and how can we figure this out together, right? How can we co-create that solution? And so it takes a little bit more effort, on the side of administrators, but it's an effort that pays for itself in the long run, because you're challenging the existing school culture, and you're also keeping young people in their school, and increasing graduation rates, right? Keeping young people off the street, and actually giving young people pathways to mitigate issues and conflict, right? You're actually helping them to engage in practices that they'll need as adults.
Build skills. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about, Maslow, right? We have to have our needs met before we can move on with anything else. And if kids are coming to school with trauma, with concerns, with a past disagreement that wasn't resolved, like you mentioned, things are only going to get worse and not get better. And again, we're back to those simple conversations, communication, building relationships. I'm trying to understand you. I want you to try to understand me. Let's connect on this human level. And that's starting from there. You also mentioned the data, like really looking at the data in terms of historically what has been happening. And I think that is another great way when we got to look at root cause. And that's another great way to really dig in and see, you know, what are our past practices and how can we make these better? How can we change this? I think that's super important. You gave us a great graphic that gave lots of terrific alternatives. So this is the graphic. This is the one you showed. And I thought this is really helpful. Can you explain this a little bit?
Sure. So this continuum of care was something that we've developed in order to provide alternatives, right? So right now, this blue circle, the dark blue circle that's really small, right? The secure out-of-home placement and aftercare, that's a really fancy term for prison. That's where all of our money is going, right? We spend $56 million roughly on youth incarceration, and the majority of that money goes to that little blue circle.
Wait, how much?
Around $56 million. So like in New Jersey, it's around $608,000 to incarcerate a single young person for 1 year.
$600,000.
Yeah, and you can educate hundreds of students through a K through 12 pipeline with resources, after school program, and everything for the price that you use to incarcerate a single child. So just imagine that. You can send a few students through Princeton University from like full ride with the money that we use to send one young person to prison in New Jersey.
That's incredible. Wow.
Right.
That's
and
incredible.
So that little blue circle is our default. It's kind of where our mind goes. It's why when you have conversations around abolition, people get uncomfortable. We don't know how to exist, you know, without and removing people from society. But that's where our money goes. And so this graphic was created to show us alternatives. That we can, if we put this first level that's orange, which are prevention services, if we put money there, which is like those things that you don't really know you need, but are there, right? Like mental health services, you integrate that into schools, right? Making sure that academic skill and literacy programs are well funded, right? Funneling money into affordable housing, right? Making sure that young people have their basic needs met, right? That's prevention services. It provides young people with a layer of protection, right? Without these things, you're more at risk for delinquent behavior, right? The pre-intervention level is when maybe there may be some additional layers of support, like parenting training or parent sensors, right? That peer-to-peer support group and community conferencing that we were talking about that would be prevalent in restorative justice hubs, right? That piece there gives them another layer of support that would hopefully push them farther away from delinquent behavior. Then you have intervention services, right? Where you have community-based intervention where something may have happened, right? But we want to divert that young person away. And so we want to intervene before it escalates. Those are the services that we provide there in that light blue level. And this dark orange level, you have your diversion services. Okay, something has happened, right? There was an incident. And you have the option now. This is where you have the option on whether or not you want to invest in that child or you want to send them away to prison. And the diversion services live here, right? Where you have, evening reporting centers where young people can come and get services after school. You don't have to necessarily suspend students. You can have them receive services outside of school hours, right? Other diversion services that will push young people away from the system. And our goal and vision is that young people will have to touch every single one of these layers, receive every single one of these services before we had default to prison.
Right. And do you see, as you go into school, when you work with schools, are you seeing a change, or is it still just right to that blue? Are you seeing some changes going on where a lot of these other services are actually taking place?
So there are some schools that really acknowledge that suspension and expulsions are a problem, and that punitive behavior does not work, but they lack the vision to see the alternatives, right? Because the alternatives are not widespread. There are not many schools not suspending students. There are not many schools not expelling students. There are not many schools not doing detention, right? So you have to think about what is available, and then create this vision for them. So this is the work that we're doing now, working from school to school, working with the legislature in New Jersey to make sure that we have not only the law on the books, but the money to fund it. And so the law that we got passed that gave $8.4 million to restorative justice programming in 4 counties in New Jersey as a pilot program, that's the money that we're leaning on to help build this out. And one of the things that we made sure was in the regulations is that this is a resource for educators and teachers. Instead of suspending your students, send them to this hub. Help them understand the implication of their actions, how their actions, impact the other person or the entity that, they had this issue with, and also how we can be accountable for that without necessarily being punitive. How can we help you grow from this situation? And so I'm really proud of that legislation. I'm really proud of that $8.4 million investment because it gives educators the option. And I will never sit here and say that schools don't want the option. They are always looking for the option, but we really lack the overarching vision at the state level that puts these things in place. And so we're doing that work now.
And Ashanti, it's going to take some good communication and education of the community to support this too, isn't it? I know my community, we actually had rallies to have this in our schools. We had parents asking for it and bringing people in to make this happen. So you have to have people in the community that understand that we're trying to help and build skills instead of punish. And so is that a big piece of this, getting community support and understanding of this paradigm change?
Oh, absolutely. Our theory of change is grounded in community engagement. And so even before I was in charge of this campaign to close youth prisons, I was a community engagement manager at NGISJ. And so what that looked like was going out into the community and helping them put words, name the issues that they were seeing. Right. And then also naming the solutions. So we would facilitate these focus groups and these sessions across the entire state in each region. And this was born, this restorative justice idea, this continuum of care was born out of community sessions. This was the baby of New Jerseyans, right? And we just put it together and made it make sense. And we are now working on the policy implementation and working out the language and the kinks that would actually put their vision, the vision that the people named, right, into place. And so this is not my baby, I'm super proud of it as if it was, but sure. This is the work of community engagement. And so folks are in line. We even host a governance team and a governance board that helps us make decisions and influence strategy. And that includes young people. So, we are good. We are not the adults who sit at the table and talk about what's good for the kids. Yeah. We let young people actually come and sit at the table because they are stewards of their own future. All we are is here to facilitate and make sure that they have all the spaces. So we have a dynamic group of young people who, who support this work.
Absolutely. It just seems like it would move society forward in leaps and bounds. Agreed. If we could all support this, not to mention the money that is spent.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't doing what it's meant to do. So I think sometimes that's what talks to people as well.
Yeah.
You had a topic that you said in your presentation in New York that the school to prison pipeline begins at home. What do you mean by that? Because we always hear schools.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. Adverse childhood experiences are real.
Yes.
And just about every kid has them. Unfortunately, Black and brown kids have them at higher rates, right? Which influences the school push out and thus the over incarceration of Black and brown people, in our juvenile justice system. But yeah, adverse childhood experiences begin at home. It's not something that, we, is the fault of any parent or of any community. Right. It's just the generational, trauma that kind of just passes through, and our kids are more absorbent than we know. And I love Alicia for this because she always talks about how our trauma lives in our body, right? The way we may be acting out a way and can't name that feeling, right? We don't know why, we responded in this way, but it lives in our body. And it lives in our young people's bodies. And that's why we often see those behavior issues that we unfortunately penalize instead of unroot, and dig through.
Yes.
And, I know that schools in New Jersey have, easy access to this, but like I said earlier, we wanted to bring this out to everyone, all of our audience, because and again, a lot of this seems like it might be, it's not basic, but we know that we should be doing other things. But I think you touched on this earlier, Ashanti, that it's either that, they may not, in schools, there may not be enough, staff and people to really oversee this and have this done correctly, or there's a time issue that's involved. And sometimes parents can come into play as well. So that's why I think your point about the community, and also specifically that school, the parents of the school need to understand we are going in a direction that, may not be what we're used to, where we have this immediate suspension as an action, but instead we're really trying to look at, individual children around all corners of this conflict, and make sure that we're addressing it in the best way possible, most sustainable way possible. So
and Ashanti, if schools want to get involved in restorative practices, are there some trainings that they need to attend, or how do they go about getting set up to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I do provide training. So if anyone's interested, they can definitely reach out to me, because I do provide training for organizations and educators on this topic and how to implement it in your own school culture and in your strategic plans. In terms of like larger trainings, there aren't really any. I mean, this restorative justice does exist in some states. So like we have some in California, you have some in Chicago and Boston. And Chicago's doing a really great job. So if any of you guys are from Chicago and are listening in, Chicago has incredible community-based restorative justice hubs, and they've reduced suspensions at one point like by 87%. So really excellent work that they're doing in Chicago. And we based the New Jersey model off of, conversations and research that we've done for Chicago. So you can definitely connect with local resources if you're there. If you don't have a local resource, I'm more than happy to chat with folks on how to do this. We did develop a toolkit as well on how to do community-based restorative justice, even without government support. So you don't necessarily need to wait on money funding from your state. We even give you grant templates, an example of how to do all of that. Yeah, all the different pieces that you need, have all of that in our toolkit. That you'll be able to, and that's a free resource, right? That free, if you want to do all the work yourself, that free resource is on our website at njisj.org. njisj.org.
All right, we'll link that also. Okay, good. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
So in the work that you're doing, and what has become clear to you?
Yeah. What has become clear to me is that this is a long game. Because a lot of it relies on changing folks' minds, right? Often we have a very clear idea on, because I will continue to speak to New Jersey because we actually have the worst racial disparity rate in the country in our juvenile justice system and our adult system, which means that we are the leaders.
By that, what do you mean by that?
We are the leaders in the nation's mass incarceration. We incarcerate Black and brown kids 17 and a half times more than we do white kids. Even though they're committing the same crimes at the same rates. White kids are still in cars, Black kids are still in cars. But unfortunately, white kids get the diversion services, right? They get station house adjustments, and they get community service, and they get just probation, while Black kids are getting prison time. And so that's exactly what's happening. And so we are the nation's lead in mass incarceration for young people and adults. And so changing folks' mind, it's heavily rooted in our history, right? It's heavily rooted in our history. It's heavily rooted in racism. And so racism is a really big monster that you can't necessarily get rid of very easily. I believe one day in the future we will be able to, exist in a society that just respects people based on their own merit. But we're just not there yet.
Yeah.
And so it's very much a long game. There's a lot more work to be done, even once we, because schools the school to prison pipeline is real and it does exist. And even if we were to stop that, it doesn't do anything about the community piece, right? They're stealing people from the community who are not necessarily, who are getting arrested and going to prison. And so there's community work to be done. There's also the politics of it all. New Jersey's still the only state that has their juvenile correction system under the Department of Corrections. Everyone else has it either under the Department of Children and Families or some other space. New Jersey's the last person who are treating our young people as adults. And so that's a whole nother layer of work to do here. And I will probably be doing this work until I retire, because it is a lot that needs to be done. So that's what has become clear to me, that this is not we've been doing this work in New Jersey for about 5 or 6 years now. And it is very clear to me that we will need another 20 to 30 to really fix the system.
Right. Well, we're so glad you're there doing the work.
Absolutely. At least there's good in that. That's for sure. I love that. Yeah. We learned so much from you last time. We just learned so much from you today. I'm really pleased that we're going to be able to, share the resources that you're providing, and share some of this mindset. It's the mindset, and share this out. Real important.
Right. Yes.
Sure. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you both again. Always a pleasure.
Oh, it's great to see you again, and keep up the good work. We're sending good vibes your way so that you can continue on and have strength to do this work, because it's a lot.
Receiving that.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for being on LinkedUp, and we will link your website so people can go in and find out more.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.